There is a moment in A Night of Seven Kingdoms, a quiet, almost throwaway moment, where a man steps forward and says, essentially, I'll take his place. He doesn't have to. No one is forcing him. He is a prince of the realm, heir to the Iron Throne, beloved by the small folk and the lords alike. He could have walked away, and no one, not a single soul in the Seven Kingdoms, would have blamed him. He was Baelor Breakspear, the best of them, the kind of prince that comes along once in a generation, maybe once in a dynasty. And he steps forward anyway, because that's who he is. And then he dies. He dies because of a random accident in a trial of 7, a chaotic melee where bodies crash into each other and the gods supposedly decide who is right. A man stumbles, a blow lands wrong, and just like that, the greatest hope the Targaryen dynasty ever had is gone. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night about this. That death, that one death of one man in a tournament in the year 209 AC, quietly, invisibly sets the stage for everything you watched in Game of Thrones. The Red Wedding, the Purple Wedding, the Battle of the Bastards, Cersei blowing up the Sept of Baelor, Daenerys burning King's Landing. All of it. Trace every thread back far enough, and you arrive at a prince who stepped forward when he didn't have to. So, today, we are going to do something a little reckless. We are going to ask, what if Baelor Breakspear lived? What does the world look like? And just how fundamentally does the entire story of Westeros change? Buckle in. This goes deep. Before we can understand what his survival means, we need to understand what the world actually lost when he died. Because I think a lot of people underestimate this. Even people who have read the Dunk and Egg novella sometimes treat Baelor's death as a sad footnote rather than the catastrophic turning point it actually is. Baelor Breakspear was the son of King Daelon II, one of the most capable kings in Targaryen history, the man who finally completed the unification of Westeros through marriage and diplomacy rather than war. Daeron the Good, they called him, and his eldest son, Baelor, was shaping up to be the kind of king who makes dynasties legendary rather than just long. What made Baelor exceptional wasn't just that he was skilled, though he was absolutely one of the finest knights in the realm. What made him exceptional was that he had something dangerously rare in a prince: judgment. The ability to read a room, read a person, or read a situation. He was not hot-headed, he was not cruel, he was not paranoid or vain or drunk on his own power the way so many of the Targaryens would eventually become. He genuinely cared about justice. And we know this because of what he does at the Trial of 7. A hedge knight named Duncan the Tall, nobody, no name, no house, no lands, is accused of striking a royal prince. In the world of Westeros, this is essentially a death sentence. There is no appeal, there is no fairness. The system is designed to crush the small and protect the powerful. Baelor sees this, sizes up the situation in moments, and rather than let the machinery of noble injustice grind this unknown hedge knight into dust, he puts his own body on the line. He volunteers to fight on Dunk's behalf. He risks and ultimately loses his life for the principle that even the lowborn deserve a fair shake. That is not a small thing. That is a man who has internalized justice rather than just performed it. And that is exactly the kind of man you want sitting on the Iron Throne. Now, compare that to what Westeros actually gets instead. After Daeron II dies, the throne eventually passes through a chain of events, including multiple succession crises, the Blackfire rebellions, plague, and the general entropy of a dynasty slowly losing its grip, to Aerys II, the Mad King, a man whose reign is defined by paranoia, cruelty, wildfire, and a spectacular inability to govern anything. A man who burns his own subjects alive for sport. A man who, in his final hours, tries to destroy the entire city of King's Landing rather than surrender it. The distance between Baelor Breakspear and Ares II is not just the distance between a good king and a bad one. It is the distance between a functioning civilization and a traumatized wasteland. And Baelor's death is the first domino. Now here's where things get complicated, because Baelor's death doesn't just affect the far future. It has immediate consequences that ripple outward in ways that shape everything else. At the time of the Trial of Seven, the Targaryen dynasty is already under enormous pressure from the Blackfyre rebellions, a series of civil wars started by the descendants of Daemon Blackfyre, a legitimized bastard of King Aegon IV, who believed he had a stronger claim to the throne than the legitimate Targaryen line. The Blackfyres are not some fringe lunatic movement. They have genuine support, genuine grievances, and genuine military power. The first Blackfyre rebellion had already come terrifyingly close to toppling the dynasty. Baelor Breakspear was one of the key military and political figures managing this threat. His ability to inspire loyalty, to command respect across different noble factions, to hold the realm together through force of personality as much as force of arms, this was not replaceable. When he died, that stabilizing force died with him. What follows in Targaryen history is a slow, grinding fragmentation. The Blackfyre threat doesn't go away. The succession becomes increasingly complicated and contested. The dragons are already gone, dead out, extinct, the last one having died over a century before Baelor's time. Without dragons, the Targaryens rule through prestige and political skill alone. And when the prestige starts to fray, when the political skill starts to deteriorate through generations of increasingly bad kings, there's nothing left to hold the whole thing together. Now, imagine Baelor lives. Baelor becomes king, probably one of the finest kings in the dynasty's history. And here's the thing about a genuinely competent, just, and beloved king. He doesn't just solve the problems of his own reign. He sets the template for his successors. He builds institutions. He cultivates loyalty. He makes the Blackfyre problem manageable rather than existential, because lords who feel fairly governed don't defect to rebel claimants. People follow the Blackfyres because they're angry. A just king gives them less to be angry about. Does this eliminate the Blackfyre threat entirely? Probably not. The claim exists regardless. But there is a massive difference between a Blackfyre rebellion that gets stamped out quickly and cleanly under a strong king and the long, bleeding wound of multiple rebellions across multiple generations that eventually hollows out the Targaryen dynasty from the inside. Baelor surviving probably means fewer Blackfyre rebellions, maybe just one more decisively crushed. And a dynasty with fewer civil wars produces heirs with less trauma, less paranoia, and less of the particular Targaryen madness that seems to flourish in conditions of instability and fear. This is the big one. This is the domino that knocks over everything else. Aerys II, Targaryen, the Mad King, was not mad from birth. He started as a young man who was charming, even likable, with flashes of genuine intelligence and vision. The madness came on gradually, fed by paranoia, by the pressures of an increasingly unstable political environment, by a suspected genetic predisposition towards mental illness that runs through the Targaryen line, and critically, by a court that enabled his worst impulses rather than checking them. But here's the thing. Aerys only ends up on the throne because of the specific succession path that Baelor helps create. With Baelor as king, the dynasty stabilizes. The reign is competent. The succession is managed carefully. The particular chain of events that produces Aerys, the specific confluence of weak kings, contested successions, and eroding royal authority, simply doesn't happen. Or at minimum, happens very differently. Without the Mad King, there's no burning of Rickard Stark and his son Brandon. There's no kidnapping of Lyanna Stark by Rhaegar. There is no Robert's Rebellion. And without Robert's Rebellion, virtually the entire premise of Game of Thrones evaporates. Think about what Robert's Rebellion actually produces. It produces a king, Robert Baratheon, who is deeply unsuited for the throne and knows it, who drowns his reign in wine and hunting and women to avoid having to think about the fact that he is fundamentally unhappy governing. It produces a power vacuum that immediately attracts the most ruthless schemers in Westeros. It produces Jon Arryn's murder, which is the match that lights the fuse on everything that follows. It produces Ned Stark being dragged south, out of his element, into a court of vipers he is constitutionally unsuited to navigate. It produces Joffrey. Good Lord, it produces Joffrey. None of this happens if Baelor lives. The Starks stay in the north where they belong. Ned Stark grows old watching his children grow up and probably trains them with that same quiet northern honor that makes him so impossible to hate and so easy to kill. Robb never has to lead an army at 16. Sansa never has to watch her father executed. Arya never has to become a weapon. The Stark family survives intact, and a Westeros where the Starks survive intact is a fundamentally different place. Here's a character study that I find genuinely fascinating to think through. Without Robert's rebellion, Daenerys Targaryen is never born into exile. She doesn't grow up on the other side of the narrow sea, hunted and powerless and utterly dependent on the goodwill of strangers. She doesn't get sold to Khal Drogo. She doesn't walk into a funeral pyre and emerge with dragons. Instead, she grows up as a princess of the realm, educated, protected, raised with the full weight of Targaryen prestige behind her. Her entire arc, that extraordinary, harrowing journey from terrified exile to mother of dragons, simply doesn't exist because the trauma that forged her doesn't exist. And this raises a genuinely uncomfortable question. Who would Daenerys have been without all of that? Would she have been better? Almost certainly safer, more comfortable, more protected. But the qualities that make her extraordinary in the show, the resilience, the willingness to burn everything down rather than bend, the ferocious certainty of her own destiny, those qualities are forged in suffering. In a stable Targaryen dynasty, she might be a perfectly lovely princess, a dignified, educated, well-married figure of court life. But would she be the breaker of chains? Would she have crossed the Dothraki Sea? Would she have walked into fire? Probably not. And that's not necessarily a tragedy. It might just mean that the dragons never came back, that the long night comes without fire meeting ice, that Westeros faces the White Walkers without the one weapon that could actually stop them. Or maybe the dragons were always going to come back. Maybe that was always written in the fabric of the world, regardless of what happened at a tournament in 209 AC. George R.R. Martin has always been coy about how much of his world is destiny versus choice. But here's the thing. The version of Daenerys that we love, that we root for across 8 seasons, that breaks our hearts in the end, that version of her requires everything that happened to her. Every loss, every humiliation, every moment of being told she was nothing. She is assembled out of pain. And a world where Baelor lives is a world where that pain never exists. One of the most interesting ripple effects of a stable Targaryen dynasty is what it does to the schemers. Pater Baelish Littlefinger is a genius of chaos. His entire methodology is based on the observation that stable systems are impenetrable to someone with no name and no house, but unstable systems can be exploited by anyone clever enough. He doesn't create chaos. He finds it, nurtures it, feeds it, and positions himself in the middle of it to harvest the benefits. In the world of GOT, he starts with the kingdom already fractured by rebellion, already riddled with old wounds and new resentments, already teetering. He just gives it a push. A stable Targaryen dynasty gives Littlefinger almost nothing to work with. He can still be clever, he can still be ruthless, but there is a world of difference between being a clever, ambitious man in a functioning kingdom and being a clever, ambitious man in a kingdom already one whisper away from collapse. In the former, the ceiling on his ambitions is much lower. The system has too much structural integrity to be brought down by one man's scheming, no matter how brilliant he is. Varys, similarly, is a product of instability. The spider thrives in the cracks. He is perpetually playing the long game for, well, we eventually learn he has his own ideological commitments, but his ability to play that game at all requires a court that is fractious, factionalized, and full of people who all want different things and can be played against each other. A court under a wise, beloved Baelor-descended king is a much harder environment for that kind of manipulation. The great tragedy of GOT is that it's full of good people, Ned, John, Rob, even Daenerys at her best, who are completely outmatched by the machinery of manipulation they find themselves trapped in. Baelor surviving doesn't necessarily mean the schemers go away, but it means they have much less to work with. The machine they feed off of is better maintained, harder to break. And maybe, just maybe, the good people win. Now, here is the part of this thought experiment that genuinely chills me. Everything we have talked about, the Starks, the Lannisters, the succession crazies, the scheming, none of it matters to the White Walkers. The Long Night is coming regardless of who sits the Iron Throne. The Night King, or whatever the show's version of that threat actually is, has been building his army in the far north for thousands of years. He is not waiting for Robert's rebellion to resolve itself. He is not watching the political situation and choosing his moment. The political chaos of GOT is a catastrophe for Westeros in terms of the White Walker threat specifically, because it exhausts and divides the realm exactly when it needs to be unified. Armies that could be marching north are dying at the Red Wedding. Resources that could be stockpiling dragonglass are being spent on siege weapons. The Night's Watch is undermanned and underfunded because nobody in King's Landing takes the threat seriously, because they're all too busy scheming against each other. A stable, competent Targaryen dynasty, the kind of Baelor would have built, potentially changes this entirely. It doesn't eliminate the White Walker threat, but it might mean that when the threat arrives, Westeros has the institutional capacity to respond to it. A strong king can command his lords to march north. A unified realm has the resources to equip its armies. A dynasty that hasn't spent a century tearing itself apart might even still have dragons by the time the Long Night arrives. Because what killed the last dragons was, in large part, the chaos of civil war and neglect, the Targaryen madness that came from a destabilized dynasty. Dragons fighting White Walkers. That's the story we almost got in GOT, and we barely got it because Daenerys brought the last 3 dragons in the world from across the sea at the last possible moment. In the world where Baelor lives, maybe those dragons never disappear in the first place. Maybe the Long Night is not a desperate, close-run, humanity nearly dies event. Maybe it's just a war. A terrible war, but a manageable one. Or maybe the Night King wins. Maybe the reason all this chaos had to happen was to forge the specific people, Jon Snow, Daenerys, Arya, even Daenerys at her best, who are completely outmatched by the machinery of manipulation they find themselves trapped in. That's the question GRRM always leaves you with, isn't it? Here's what I keep coming back to. Baelor Breakspear died because he was good. Not good in the way that is convenient or safe or politically calculated, good in the way that costs you something. He saw a man who was about to be crushed by a system that didn't care about him, and he put himself in between that man and the machine, and it killed him. And his goodness killed him, and the absence of his goodness killed a dynasty, and the death of that dynasty killed hundreds of thousands of people across a century and a half that followed. The Red Wedding, the Sept of Baelor, the Long Night nearly consuming the world. One step forward, one act of genuine decency, and the ripples spread forward across 150 years of history until they become tsunamis. George R.R. Martin has spent his career arguing, not cynically, but tragically, which is different, that the world punishes goodness, that the Ned Starks and Baelor Breakspears don't get to win, that virtue without power is just another form of helplessness. The question his whole body of work is wrestling with is whether that's true, and whether it has to be true, and whether there is any version of the story where someone like Baelor gets to live long enough to actually make a difference. He hasn't answered that question yet. He's still writing. But in the meantime, light a candle for Baelor Breakspear, the prince who stepped forward when he didn't have to, the man who might have saved everything. If only he'd lived.